Introduction: The Interruption. In the old graveyard of Draban, a village in Dera Ismail Khan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Pakistan, located a few miles from the foothills of the Sulaiman Mountains, generations lie buried. The graveyard stands to the west of the village, the graves clustered around now fast-vanishing Peeloo trees. What reveals itself there in the presence of death is not merely the end of biological life, but a profound interruption of the ordinary. Death arrives as the greatest shock a human being can endure, a rupture so violent that it temporarily suspends all mundane concerns, all habits, all the unthinking momentum of daily existence. Yet this rupture, however powerful, does not permanently alter the texture of living. After the burial, after the prayers, the crowd disperses, life resumes, and slowly, sometimes almost imperceptibly, the raw edge of grief dulls. The dead are not forgotten, but the pain no longer dominates consciousness. This raises a philosophical puzzle. Why are we not haunted by death all the time? Why does the loss of what once felt unbearable gradually lose its power over us? The answer lies not in the insignificance of death, but in the nature of the human mind and the structure of everyday social existence. To understand this, we must weave together insights from Buddhist psychology, Nietzschean philosophy, and above all, the existential analytic of Martin Heidegger. The graveyard gives us a glimpse of truth. Everydayness gives us the means to survive it. Part 1. The moving mind as psychological ground. The human mind is not a static chamber where a single thought can permanently reside. It is a site of constant movement, a flux of impressions, memories, anticipations, and distractions, each displacing the other without our deliberate consent. Buddhism names this the monkey mind, Sanskrit, kapicita, restless, leaping endlessly from one branch to another, incapable of sustained fixation on any single object unless repeatedly trained through disciplined meditation. Nietzsche recognized a related instability in human thought. In Beyond Good and Evil, he observes that thoughts do not arrive when we wish them, but when they wish. They emerge suddenly, without obvious cause or warning, as if generated from a hidden depth. This is not a failure of will, but a structural feature of consciousness. The mind is a medium through which thoughts flow, not a fortress in which thoughts are imprisoned. No act of volition can permanently arrest this movement. Even the most determined effort to hold a single idea, whether of a beloved face, a philosophical principle, or the certainty of one's own death, will eventually be overtaken by the spontaneous emergence of new impressions. Grief, even the profound grief caused by death, is not exempt from this condition. The death of a loved one can dominate the mind for days, months, or years. But the sensory world, the body's needs, and the environment's provocations continuously generate new thoughts that compete with grief for the limited space of consciousness. Hunger interrupts sorrow. Physical pain demands attention. A sudden sound redirects focus. The metabolic reality of the living organism is such that it must constantly orient itself toward immediate survival needs: food, shelter, safety, social connection. These needs produce thoughts whether we invite them or not. This is not a matter of willful evasion or moral failure. It is a matter of cognitive architecture. The mind cannot remain fixed on a single idea forever, not even on death. To be conscious at all is to be subject to the constant emergence of the new. A being that felt the full weight of its own finitude at every waking moment would be paralyzed, unable to eat, work, or plan for a future that it knows will be truncated. The fading of grief is not a betrayal of love, but a condition of continued existence. The dead remain dead, the living must eat. However, the moving mind alone does not fully explain why we are not haunted. After all, one could imagine a mind that, despite its restlessness, repeatedly returns to death as a recurring theme, like a needle that keeps jumping back to the same groove on a record. That this does not generally happen suggests a second layer of explanation: the social organisation of forgetting. Part 2. The they and the social structure of evasion. If the moving mind supplies the psychological possibility of escaping the thought of death, Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976, provides the social ontological mechanism by which that possibility is systematically realized. In his masterwork, Being and Time, 1927, Heidegger analyzes human existence, which he calls Dasein, being there, and distinguishes between authentic, eigentlich, and inauthentic, uneigentlich existence. Authenticity means living in a way that is truly one's own, owning one's finitude, choices, and death. Inauthenticity means drifting passively with the anonymous crowd. Heidegger describes ordinary social existence as life under das Man, the they. This is not a conspiracy, a class of people, or a set of explicit rules. It is a mode of being, a structure of normativity in which individuals are absorbed into public routines, shared expectations, and anonymous rhythms. One does what people do, thinks what one thinks, feels what is socially appropriate to feel. The they relieves the individual of the burden of choosing for oneself. It provides ready-made interpretations for every significant human experience, including death. Life flows forward with momentum, and the possibility of authentic confrontation quietly dissolves into unreflective habit. The they develops a distinctive way of talking about death. One dies eventually, but not right now. Death happens, but it's not something to dwell on. Everyone dies sometime. These are not false statements. Their evasion lies not in their factual content, but in their function. They transform death from my most personal possibility into a neutral, impersonal event that happens to someone else, never to me. When we read of a stranger's death in the newspaper, we feel distant sympathy, then turn the page. When someone near us dies, the they supplies comforting formulas. Life goes on. We must carry on for the living. He would have wanted you to be happy. Heidegger calls this the tranquilization, Beruhigung, of death. The they does not deny death. It cannot, because death is too obvious, too public, too undeniable. Corpses are buried, obituaries are printed. Everyone knows that everyone dies. Instead, the they covers death over with three interconnected phenomena. 1. Chatter, gereda, the endless circulation of talk that levels down all genuine mystery into the familiar and the manageable. Chatter does not suppress the topic of death. It exhausts it through cliché, rendering it unremarkable. 2. Curiosity, nouge, the restless drive for novelty, for the next piece of news, the next entertainment, the next distraction. Curiosity ensures that attention never settles on any one thing for long, least of all on the one thing that cannot be turned into a spectacle. 3. Ambiguity, Zweideutigkeit, the fog of interpretation in which everything is possible, nothing is certain, and commitment is perpetually deferred. In ambiguity, death becomes something that might matter or might not, but in either case, not urgently. Together, these three phenomena constitute a machinery of evasion. We stay busy. We seek novelty. We project plans far into the future. Death recedes into the distant horizon, always coming, never here. The they's tranquilization is not a conscious deception, but a structural feature of everyday social existence. The absorption of the individual into a public interpretation of life that systematically conceals the urgency of individual finitude. Death is dangerous to the they's rhythm. It disrupts it completely. This is why the they work so hard to domesticate death through ritual, euphemism, and delay. The funeral itself, as we shall see, is handled by the they as a contained event, a scheduled disruption that is permitted precisely because it will end. Part 3. The funeral as existential rupture. A funeral is one of the rare moments when the machinery of das Man breaks down, or rather, when it is temporarily suspended by force of event. The daily tempo stops. The future appears suddenly finite. For a brief window, perhaps only minutes, each mourner knows, with a clarity that philosophical argument cannot produce, that I too will die, that I too will be carried one day to a grave. In the graveyard of Draban, standing to the west of the village just miles from the Sulaiman Mountains, this rupture occurs repeatedly. The collective grief is not mere performance. It is a genuine confrontation with what Heidegger calls the nothing, das Nichts, not a thing, but the groundlessness that underlies all things. At this moment, death is not primarily a biological event, demise verenden, but what Heidegger calls being towards death, sein zum Tod, the existential mode in which one anticipates one's own most possibility, the possibility of no longer having any possibilities whatsoever. Heidegger identifies 3 formal characteristics of death as an existential phenomenon. First, death is ownmost, eigenster. It is the one possibility that belongs to me alone and cannot be transferred to another. No one can die my death for me. A substitute can take my place in battle, can pay my debts, can care for my children, but no one can undergo my non-existence on my behalf. Second, death is non-relational, unbezuglich. It cuts through all my relations to others, isolating me in the face of my finitude. In the moment of authentic confrontation, I am no longer primarily a father, a worker, a citizen, a neighbour. I am simply a being who will cease to be. All social roles fall away as the contingent costumes they are. Third, death is not to be outstripped, unüberholbar. It is the final possibility, the horizon against which all other possibilities appear as finite and therefore as choice-worthy in a new way. The graveyard forces what Heidegger calls anxiety, Angst, not fear, Furcht, of any specific threat, but the mood in which the world as a whole becomes uncanny, unheimlich. Fear has a definite object, a snake, an enemy, a falling object. We can fight the object or flee from it. Anxiety, by contrast, has no object. It is the experience that the world itself, the entire meaningful structure of everyday life, is slipping away. In anxiety, the everyday things we cling to, our roles, possessions, relationships, plans, no longer feel like solid ground. The they's distractions lose their anesthetic power. One is left alone with oneself, not a comfortable self, but a self stripped of all evasion, all alibis, all excuses. This is why Heidegger advised in a 1961 seminar that we should spend more time in graveyards, not as a morbid exercise, but as a philosophical one. The graveyard reveals what everyday life systematically conceals, that all our roles, ambitions, and distractions are temporary arrangements made in the shadow of an unavoidable end. The graveyard is not a place of death, but a place of truth, provided one does not flee from what it shows. However, and this is crucial, even this confrontation has a limit. The funeral itself is a scheduled rupture. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Prayers are recited, earth is thrown. Then the mourners disperse. The very structure of the funeral as a social ritual contains within it the permission to return. The they does not oppose the funeral. It organises it. And by organising it, the they ensures that the rupture will be temporary. The graveyard visit is permitted precisely because it will be followed by departure. Part 4. The return to everydayness as necessity. After the burial, after the prayers, the crowd disperses. The mourners return home. Soon after, sometimes within hours, the pull of Das Man reasserts itself. Life resumes its rhythm. Meals to prepare, work to complete, conversations to hold, plans to make. The mind fills again with tasks, concerns, trivia. Death retreats to the background. The uncanny becomes familiar again. The anxiety subsides. This return is not a failure. It is a structural necessity of finite existence. Heidegger recognizes this clearly. He does not suggest that we can or should live in a perpetual state of anxiety. Perpetual anxiety would be its own form of paralysis, indistinguishable from madness. Dasein exists as thrownness, Geworfenheit. We are born into a particular time, culture, family, and historical situation. We do not choose our language, our customs, our social roles. They are given to us before we can question them. Consequently, we cannot escape the they entirely. Even the most authentic Dasein must eat, work, converse, and participate in shared social life. Authenticity is not an escape from everydayness, but a transformed mode of inhabiting everydayness. Heidegger introduces the term falling, verfallen, not as a moral judgment but as a descriptive one. Falling describes Dasein's natural tendency to become absorbed in the world, to lose itself in the concerns of the moment. Falling is not sin, not a fall from a higher state of purity. It is a structural feature of existence. To be in the world is to be drawn toward the world. The they is not an evil empire, but the ordinary medium of social life. To speak is to use the they's language. To work is to occupy a they-defined role. To love is to follow culturally shaped scripts. Even the most resolute individual must operate within these structures. There is no authentic language, no authentic job, no authentic romance that exists outside the social world. The difference between authentic and inauthentic existence is therefore not that one escapes the they while the other does not. That is impossible. The difference lies in how one inhabits everydayness. Inauthentic Dasein is absorbed into the they without awareness. It flees from death into distraction, never acknowledging what it is fleeing. It takes the chatter of the they as the final truth. It moves through life as if death were something that happens only to others, only later, only eventually. When the funeral's rupture occurs, inauthentic Dasein experiences it as an interruption of the normal, to be endured, then forgotten. Authentic Dasein has seen death clearly, has owned its finitude, and then returns to everyday life, but returns differently. It now understands that the tasks and routines of ordinary existence are not ultimate. They are provisional, finite, shot through with the possibility of loss. Authentic Dasein moves through the world with what Heidegger calls resoluteness, Entschlossenheit, a silent, ongoing orientation that does not constantly announce itself but quietly underlies every action. Resoluteness is not a perpetual grimness. It is not a refusal to laugh, to enjoy, to plan for the long term. It is a background awareness that transforms the foreground of everyday activity without abolishing it. The resolute person can participate fully in the they's practices while remaining aware that these practices are not the whole of truth. She can build a house knowing it will one day crumble. She can raise a child knowing the child will one day die. She can pursue a career knowing the career will end. This knowing does not make the activities meaningless. On the contrary, it makes them meaningful as finite, as precious precisely because they are temporary. The tragedy is not that we return to routine. The tragedy is that we rarely carry the funeral's insight with us for long. Most of us fall back into absorption without residue. The anxiety fades entirely, rather than condensing into resoluteness. The graveyard's gift is lost before we reach the village gate. Part 5. Philosophical extensions. What traditions have tried to do about this? The double structure we have described, the moving mind and the they's tranquilization, poses a fundamental challenge to any philosophical or religious tradition that seeks to keep death authentically present in consciousness. Several traditions have attempted to counteract this structure, and examining their strategies illuminates, by contrast, the Heideggerian position. Stoicism offers one approach. The Stoic exercises of praemeditatio malorum, premeditation of evils, and memento mori, remember that you will die, are deliberate practices designed to overcome the natural movement of the mind away from troubling thoughts. The Stoic advises daily visualization of one's own death, of the loss of loved ones, of the destruction of one's city. By repeatedly bringing death before the mind, the Stoic aims to render it familiar, to strip it of its terror, and to ensure that one never acts as if one were immortal. Marcus Aurelius writes, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." Yet even Stoicism acknowledges the difficulty of sustained attention. The exercises are meant to be repeated precisely because the mind naturally drifts. The Stoic does not claim that one visualization suffices for a lifetime. The practice must be daily, even hourly. This tacitly concedes the power of the moving mind. If death's presence were natural, no exercise would be required. Buddhism offers a more radical approach. The meditation on the charnel ground, a practice described in the Satipatthana Sutta, involves contemplating a corpse in various stages of decay, swollen, discoloured, being eaten by animals, reduced to bones, finally to dust. This is not a casual reminder, but a systematic retraining of perception. The goal is to uproot the deep-seated illusion of permanence that the moving mind and the they collaboratively sustain. A fully enlightened being, arahant, is said to perceive impermanence, anicca, directly and continuously, without effort and without interruption. If such a being is possible, then the claim that the mind cannot remain fixed on death is not a universal law of consciousness, but a description of the unawakened mind. The Buddha would agree that the ordinary untrained mind moves restlessly, but he would insist that through discipline, through bhavana, mental cultivation, this restlessness can be stilled. The monkey can be tamed. Heidegger is not a Buddhist, and being and time contains no soteriology. Heidegger would likely respond that the Buddhist arahant, if such a being exists, has ceased to be Dasein in Heidegger's sense. Dasein is defined by care, sorge, by being always ahead of itself in projection toward possibilities. An arahant who no longer craves, no longer fears, no longer projects. That being might be something admirable, but it is not the structure Heidegger is analysing. For ordinary human existence, for you, for me, for the mourners in Draban, the movement of the mind and the pull of they are inescapable features of the condition. The return to everydayness is not a failure to achieve enlightenment. It is the shape of finite life. Existentialism after Heidegger has developed this tension further. Maurice Blanchot, in The Space of Literature, argues that death cannot be experienced directly or held in consciousness. Death is not an event that happens to me, but the impossibility of my having any event at all. To try to think death is to try to think the unthinkable. The mind does not merely move away from death. It cannot approach death except asymptotically. For Blanchot, the return to everydayness is not a falling away from truth, but the very condition that makes truth possible. The everyday is where we live. Death is where we do not. This line of thought suggests a revision to our earlier language. Perhaps we are not haunted by death not because of a deficiency in us, but because death is not the sort of thing that can haunt in a sustained way. Haunting requires a ghost, a presence that remains. Death is not a presence but an absence, a horizon, a limit. One cannot be haunted by a limit. One can only be oriented by it. Part 6. The trace as the structure of finite truth. If the return to everydayness is inevitable, and if even the most authentic design cannot permanently hold death before the mind, what then remains of the funeral's revelation? Does it all evaporate? Is the graveyard experience merely a temporary emotion, as fleeting as the ache of a muscle after exertion? No. Something remains. Not a constant haunting, not perpetual grief, not a thought that stays, but a trace. The authentic design, the one who has truly confronted death in anxiety, who has felt the uncanniness of the world, who has owned finitude as ownmost and non-relational, does not escape the return to everydayness. No one does. But that design returns knowing. The chatter of the "they no longer fully convinces" because it has been seen through. The distractions no longer fully distract because their function as evasion has been exposed. In the midst of routine, while shopping, while working, while conversing, a quiet awareness persists, not as a continuous thought, but as a readiness. The trace is not a content, but a capacity. The capacity to remember finitude when finitude matters most, to act in the light of death without being paralyzed by it. Heidegger calls this anticipatory resoluteness, vorlaufende Entschlossenheit, the ongoing projection of oneself toward death while remaining fully engaged in the tasks of life. It is a paradoxical mode of existence, holding oneself in the possibility of impossibility while planting trees, raising children, writing books, and making plans. The resolute person does not cease to plan, but the plans now carry a silent awareness that they may fail, that they will end, that they are not the ground of meaning. The ground of meaning, if there is one, is the finite self who chooses in the face of nothing. The trace is fragile. It can be overwhelmed by the next crisis, the next pleasure, the next demand. It must be renewed, not through constant grim rehearsal of death, but through periodic return to the graveyard, periodic exposure to the uncanny, periodic willingness to let anxiety do its individuating work. Heidegger's advice to spend more time in graveyards is not a prescription for morbid rumination. It is a recognition that the trace fades and must be refreshed. Authenticity is not a permanent achievement but a recurrent task. In this sense, the structure of finite truth is rhythmic, not static. We move between absorption and rupture, between the they's tranquilization and the anxiety of the graveyard, between forgetting and remembering. Neither pole is the final home. The wise do not demand that the rupture last forever. They do not demand that the trace become an obsession. They simply return, again and again, to the place where the veil lifts, and then they go back to the marketplace, carrying something invisible in their pocket. Conclusion: the rhythm of finitude. We can now answer the original question. Why are we not haunted by death all the time? Not because death is unreal, not because grief is shallow, not because philosophy or religion has resolved finitude. We are not haunted because of a double structure that is both psychological and social. Psychologically, the moving mind continuously generates new impressions that displace the thought of death. Socially, the they provides ready-made interpretations, comforting formulas, and endless distractions that collectively tranquilize the urgency of finitude. These two levels reinforce each other, constituting a system of existential analgesia that allows human beings to function in the face of an unbearable truth. Yet the graveyard visit, the funeral, the moment of rupture, reveals what the system conceals. In anxiety, the veil lifts. For a brief window, each mourner knows, I too will die. This knowledge is not a piece of information, but a transformation of the self's relation to itself. It is the moment of authenticity, the moment of owning finitude as one's own. But because authenticity cannot be sustained, Dasein returns to everydayness. This return is not a failure, but a necessity. The difference between authentic and inauthentic existence lies in how the return is inhabited. Inauthentic existence returns without residue, absorbed once more into the they's tranquilization, forgetting that it has forgotten. Authentic existence returns bearing a trace, a quiet, intermittent awareness that all tasks are finite, that all projects end, that the chatter of the they is not the final truth. The resolute person lives in the marketplace but carries the graveyard in the bones. Thus the rhythm of finitude. 1. Everydayness. Life under the they, absorbed in routine and chatter, fleeing from death into the busyness of the world. 2. Rupture. The funeral or graveyard visit where anxiety shatters the they's tranquilization and, being towards death, becomes possible. 3. Return. The movement back into everydayness which is inevitable and necessary for survival. 4. Trace. The residual awareness of finitude that transforms how one inhabits the everyday without escaping it. Death visits briefly. The wise do not demand that it stay. They simply remember, in the midst of shops and children and labour, that they too will one day lie beneath a vanishing tree, and that remembering, fragile, intermittent, easily overwhelmed, always in need of renewal, is the beginning of authenticity.